He only wanted to find his father's watch. But at the dump, he stumbled upon an old house where children lived. What happened next changed his life. See how the story ends. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Michael woke before dawn, the pale light just beginning to slip through the curtains. For a moment he lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling that half-dream state where everything is quiet and suspended. His hand, almost on its own, reached toward the nightstand. His fingers brushed empty wood. The familiar weight of the watch, the one thing he never failed to check each morning, was gone. At first he thought perhaps it had fallen, that it was hiding under some book or in a fold of the blanket. He sat up, pulled open the drawer, looked behind the lamp. The space was too bare, too clean, as if something had been removed deliberately. He froze, staring at that empty spot, and a slow heaviness settled over him. That watch had belonged to his father. He could still remember the day he had been given it, the scent of machine oil from the garage, his father's rough hands holding his wrist, fastening the worn leather strap with care. "Time is all we ever really own," his father had said, half smiling in that quiet way of his. "Don't waste it." Michael had kept those words with him as much as the watch itself, checking it not only for the hour but for the sense that his father was still with him somehow. A growing dread drove him to get out of bed and search the entire room. He opened every drawer, looked under the bed, even checked the bathroom counter. When he finally turned toward the kitchen, he found his wife standing there, already dressed, her arms folded tight across her chest. The look on her face told him the answer before she spoke. "You're not going to find it," she said, her voice clipped and cold, as though she had been rehearsing it all night. "I threw it away." He stood there for a long moment, unable to process what she had said. "You? What?" he asked, not because he hadn't heard, but because he could not believe it. "It was just a watch," she said, turning toward the coffee pot as if this were an ordinary morning. "After last night, I couldn't stand seeing it on that table, so I tossed it out with the trash." The words hit him like a punch to the ribs. Just a watch. She didn't know, or maybe she did, how much it meant to him, how that watch was not a piece of metal, but the last physical connection to his father. Something in him felt torn open, a hollow ache that filled with hot anger before he could stop it. He turned away, not trusting himself to speak, because if he did, the words would come out sharper than knives. For a long time he stood in the kitchen, staring out the window, the sunlight now spilling over the neighborhood, lighting up the neat lawns and clean sidewalks. Somewhere out there, the city garbage trucks had already done their work, hauling away the bins lined up at the curb. Somewhere in all that noise and refuse were his father's watch, buried beneath banana peels, coffee grounds, plastic wrappers. The thought of it lying there, crushed and anonymous, felt unbearable. Michael went to the garage, grabbed a pair of work gloves, and got into his truck. He didn't have a plan, not really. All he knew was that he could not sit in that house one more minute, while the last thing of his father's lay out there in a landfill, disappearing into oblivion. The engine roared to life, and he drove through the still, quiet streets, heading toward the edge of town, where the municipal dump sprawled over acres of open land. The air grew heavier as he approached. Even before he reached the gate, he could smell it, a sour mixture of rotting food, burnt plastic, and damp earth. Seagulls circled overhead in lazy, screaming arcs. A man in a reflective vest waved him through when Michael explained he had lost something valuable. The man gave him a look that was part amusement, part pity, and told him to stay clear of the bulldozers. The ground squelched beneath his boots as he stepped out. Mountains of trash stretched as far as he could see, a shifting landscape of discarded furniture, crushed cans, broken electronics, and bags split open by the machinery. He pulled out his phone, more out of instinct than reason, and started recording. Maybe he wanted proof of what he was doing, or maybe he thought in some distant way that he could show it to his wife, make her understand what she had forced him to do. At first he moved carefully, scanning the ground for anything that might gleam. The watch had a brass case, and he imagined it catching the light, calling him like a beacon. But the more he looked, the more hopeless it seemed. The trash from an entire neighborhood had been dumped together, compacted and smeared into an indistinguishable mess. After an hour of fruitless searching, sweat running down his back despite the morning chill, he stopped to catch his breath. That was when he saw it, a small structure at the far end of the lot, half hidden by a pile of discarded pallets and rusted metal sheets. It looked almost like a shack, thrown together from whatever pieces someone could find. Smoke curled faintly from a tin can outside the doorway, as if someone had tried to make a fire. Curiosity pulled him toward it. The closer he came, the more it looked like an actual dwelling, a place meant to be lived in, rather than just a random pile. He stepped carefully, not wanting to startle anyone, and when he reached the doorway, he saw movement inside. 3 pairs of eyes stared back at him from the dim interior. Children, 2 girls and a boy, huddled together at the back of the shack. The boy, who looked no older than 12, straightened and put himself slightly in front of the girls, as if shielding them. The oldest girl clutched a cracked plastic bowl to her chest, her chin lifted in defiance. The youngest one, with tangled hair and a dirt-smudged face, peered at him with wide, wary eyes. Michael felt his breath catch. This was not what he had expected to find. The inside of the shack was a strange mix of tragedy and determination. Old mattresses laid on crates for beds, a pile of canned goods and bottles of water in one corner, a makeshift table with scavenged dishes, and on the wall, a row of broken toys lined up as though they were treasures in a museum. He lifted his phone again, recording almost without thinking, capturing the scene that felt like a secret the world had tried to bury, along with its garbage. The boy finally spoke, his voice low, and Michael didn't catch the words, but the tone was clear. A challenge, a warning not to come closer. He held up his free hand, palms open, to show he meant no harm. Then he took a step back, giving them space, and pointed to his own wrist, miming the shape of a watch. He tried to explain with gestures that he was looking for something precious, something small. The children glanced at one another. The boy shrugged, then shook his head. Michael reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill, and held it up, a promise of a reward if they found it. This time their eyes flickered with interest. When he left the dump that afternoon, he felt no closer to finding the watch, but something had shifted. The image of the children stayed with him, haunting him even as he drove back through the city. Their faces, their home cobbled together from refuse, the smoke rising from that tiny can, it was burned into his mind. That night he sat at the kitchen table, the house dark except for the glow of his phone. He played back the video he had recorded, his own boots crunching over trash, the wind, the shack, the children. He watched it twice, 3 times, each time feeling a tighter pull in his chest. When he finally turned off the phone, he knew one thing. He would go back tomorrow, and he would keep going back until he found what he was looking for, even if what he found was not the watch at all, but something he had not even known he had lost. The next morning, Michael woke before his alarm. There had been little real sleep that night. His mind kept circling back to the image of the children in that shack, to the way the boy had stepped in front of the girls, protective but proud, as if the tiny patch of ground they stood on was their entire kingdom. The memory would not leave him. He sat at the table with his coffee, staring out at the street as the trash truck rumbled by, and realized that the thought of returning to the dump did not fill him with disgust or dread as it had the day before. It felt almost like a duty. By the time he reached the dump again, the sun was climbing high, turning the air heavy and acrid. The men in vests recognized him now, one of them waving him through with a smirk that said he was becoming a regular. He parked his truck near the same spot and pulled on his gloves, scanning the horizon until he saw the patch of rusted metal and wood that marked the children's home. This time he did not approach quietly. He called out a greeting before he came too close, letting them hear him coming. The boy appeared in the doorway, narrow-eyed, but not as tense as before. Michael kept his hands open and took slow steps forward until he was close enough to see their faces clearly. The oldest girl was seated on one of the crates, braiding the younger one's hair. It struck him as such an ordinary, tender act in a place that was anything but ordinary. He pointed again to his wrist, repeating the gesture for the watch, then mimed digging and searching. The boy watched him silently, then pointed toward a heap of fresh trash that had been dumped earlier that morning. Michael nodded, as though they had struck a bargain. He pulled a second folded bill from his pocket, held it up briefly, and then tucked it away. The boy's lips tightened, but there was the faintest flicker of interest in his eyes. The rest of the day passed in slow, grueling work. Michael sifted through bags, broken boxes, piles of debris, turning over boards, scanning every glint of metal in the hope that it might be the watch. From time to time, he would glance back toward the shack and see the children watching him, their faces impassive, though the smallest girl sometimes crept closer, as if curiosity pulled her despite herself. Over the next few days, this routine became almost ritual. He would wake early, drive to the dump, spend hours searching, then sit on the tailgate of his truck, drinking water and watching the strange little world around him come to life. The children worked with a quiet efficiency that both impressed and unsettled him. They had a system. The boy used a hook stick to pull pieces of scrap metal from the piles. The older girl sorted plastic bottles into sacks. The younger one ran back and forth with anything that could be sold. Sometimes they found food, bruised fruit, dented cans, and they would carry it back to the shack as if it were treasure. Michael began to understand that this was not just survival, but a kind of chosen order. These children had been here long enough to make this place their own. The shack was patched and reinforced, the path leading to it swept clear of dangerous glass or nails, the inside arranged with care. They had turned the chaos of the dump into something resembling a home. One afternoon, as he was filming with his phone, the boy walked up to him and pointed to the screen. Michael hesitated, then showed him the recording, the piles of trash, the scavenger birds, the shack with smoke rising from its tin can chimney. The boy watched in silence, his expression unreadable, then simply nodded and walked back. Something in that nod felt like permission. That night, Michael posted the video to his social media account. He did not add commentary, only the caption, "This is where some kids live in our city." He thought little of it until the next morning, when his phone buzzed with dozens of notifications. People were sharing the video, commenting with shock, anger, pity. By evening, it had been viewed thousands of times. News outlets were tagging him, asking for an interview. The sudden attention made Michael uneasy. He had wanted to document what he saw, to capture the stark reality of that place, but now strangers were calling it a tragedy, a disgrace, a scandal. Some people demanded that the authorities step in. Others offered donations. Volunteers messaged him asking if they could bring food or clothes. The next day at the dump, he noticed the change even before he reached the shack. There were fresh tire tracks leading in, and a box of packaged food had been left outside. The children were inside, the boy standing stiffly at the door, his eyes hard. Michael felt a twist of guilt as he realized what he had done. He had turned their hidden refuge into something public. He kept coming back, partly out of hope that the watch might still appear, but more and more because he felt responsible for what would happen next. He spoke quietly to the boy when he could, offered small items, a clean blanket, a bottle of water, but he sensed the children's growing tension. They had seen outsiders before. They knew what came after the attention. One morning, the inevitable happened. A white van with the city emblem pulled into the lot, followed by a police car. Two social workers got out, clipboards in hand, and began walking toward the shack. Michael stood frozen, his stomach sinking. The boy saw them too and shouted something to the girls inside. What followed felt both slow and too fast to stop. The children ran, but there was nowhere to go. The officers caught up with them near the edge of the lot, speaking in firm but not unkind voices. The oldest girl fought, kicking and thrashing, screaming words Michael could not hear. The youngest cried so hard her face turned red. The boy struggled until the last moment, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on Michael as if accusing him. The shack was left standing, but empty. The smoke in the can went out, leaving only a faint smell of burnt paper. The sound of the van's doors closing echoed across the dump, then faded as it drove away. Michael stayed long after everyone else had gone. He walked into the shack, sat down on one of the mattresses, and stared at the walls. It felt different now, abandoned, stripped of life, as though the children's presence had been the only thing holding the place together. When he finally left, the sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the heaps of trash. He felt no closer to finding the watch. Instead, he carried a heavier burden, the sense that he had set something in motion that could not be undone. That night, as he watched the latest news segment about the rescue of 3 children from a dangerous illegal settlement, he saw his own video playing on the screen. The anchors called him a concerned citizen. People online praised him, but all he could see was the boy's eyes as he was taken away, the way they had burned with betrayal. Michael shut off the television and sat in silence. The house was dark again, as it had been that first night. But now there was no anticipation of searching the next day, no purpose to drive him forward. Only a question that would not leave his mind. Had he done the right thing, or had he destroyed the only life those children knew? When he went to bed, he knew he would not sleep. And when dawn came, he knew he would go back to the dump anyway. Not to search for the watch this time, but because something there was unfinished, something that still demanded an answer. Morning came gray and windless, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Michael drove past the dump without stopping this time. He could not bring himself to face the empty shack again. Not yet. Instead, he followed the address of the municipal shelter that had been mentioned in the news. The building stood at the far end of a quiet street, surrounded by a chain-link fence. It looked too clean, too square, the kind of place meant to be efficient rather than kind. Through the gate, he could see children playing on a cracked basketball court. Some were laughing, others sitting sullenly along the edges. It looked normal at first glance, but he knew better. Somewhere inside those walls were the 3 children whose lives had been ripped out of the fragile order they had built. He parked and sat in the truck for a long time, just watching. He could not bring himself to go inside. He had no legal right to see them, no reason other than his own gnawing guilt. Inside, the first hours had felt almost like a dream for the children. They had been given clean clothes that did not smell of smoke or rot, warm showers that filled the room with steam, hot meals served on plastic trays. For a moment, it had seemed like a reprieve. But as the days passed, the dream soured. The other children noticed the newcomers and whispered about where they had come from. Words like trash rats and dump kids followed them down the hallways. The boy, whose name Michael still did not know, began to get into fights. He did not start them, but he finished them, and each time he was punished by being separated from his sisters for hours at a time. The older girl withdrew into herself, staring out windows, her hands clenched so tight they trembled. The youngest, who had cried so hard the day they were taken, no longer cried at all. She just stopped speaking. Michael learned some of this from overheard conversations, from reporters' follow-ups, from the snippets of gossip that spread online. The news stations moved on quickly as they always did, but his conscience did not. At night he replayed the moment of the van doors closing, the boy's eyes on him, and felt a hollow space open inside him. He returned to the dump several times as if to punish himself. The shack still stood but looked sadder each day, the wind tugging at the panels, scattering scraps across the dirt. Once he found one of the girl's toys lying in the dust, a small headless doll with its dress half torn. He put it back on the shelf inside, as if by doing so he could keep the place alive until they returned. Though he told himself that was impossible, the shelter became their cage. The children tried to hold on to one another, to the little routines they had made for themselves at the dump, but the walls pressed in. Nights were the worst. Too many voices, too much noise, the smells of bleach and strangers all around them. The boy began to whisper plans in the dark, tracing out the route back to the dump in his head. He knew which windows had broken latches, which sections of fence were weak. Michael felt his own life sliding into disarray. He could not concentrate at work, could not bring himself to talk to his wife beyond the bare minimum. She watched him with wary eyes, perhaps realizing that the watch had been only the beginning of something larger breaking between them. He spent hours at night scrolling through articles about child welfare, about the failures of the system, reading testimony from kids who had run away from foster care again and again. One evening, as he sat in his truck near the shelter, he saw movement near the back fence. 3 small figures crept along the shadows, pausing when headlights swept by on the street. His heart lurched when he realized who they were. They moved with a determination that made them look older than they were, like soldiers escaping enemy lines. He did not get out of the truck, did not call for anyone to stop them. Something in him told him this was their choice, and that no one had the right to take it from them again. He followed at a distance, careful not to be seen, as they disappeared into the night. The route they took was straight toward the edge of the city, toward the dump that had been their home. He drove the long way around, giving them time, and by the time he arrived, the moon had risen and the night was still. The shack glowed faintly from within. They had lit the little can again, the fire flickering against the patched walls. Michael stood for a moment in the darkness, watching. Relief flooded him. Relief so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. They were alive. They were here. They had chosen this place over the shelter, over the city. He approached slowly so as not to frighten them. This time the boy did not step in front of the girls with hostility. He simply stood there, breathing hard, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, looking at Michael with something like weary recognition. The older girl sat by the fire, holding the youngest close, rocking her as though she were a much smaller child. Michael crouched down near the doorway, not entering, just waiting. He had no watch to offer this time, no bargain to make. There was only the quiet promise forming in his mind that he would not let this cycle repeat. He could not bring himself to drag them back, nor could he walk away and leave them here to face winter alone. The fire popped softly in the can, sparks rising into the night. The smell of smoke mixed with the sharp scent of refuse, a smell he had once found unbearable, but now associated with something fierce and resilient. When he finally turned back toward his truck, he knew that tomorrow would not be like the days before. Tomorrow he would begin to do something more than watch and record. He would act. The guilt that had weighed him down began to transform into a sense of purpose, heavy but clear. He drove home under the cold stars, already planning what calls he would make, what organizations he would contact, and what it would take to change the ending of this story. The children had returned to the only place that had ever been theirs. He would have to find a way to give them something better, not by forcing them into a system that had failed them, but by building something new. Morning came cold and bright, the kind of morning that made every shadow look sharp. Michael stood in his kitchen, staring at the phone on the counter. The decision he had made during the night had hardened into something that felt unshakable. He began making calls, his voice steady but carrying an urgency that surprised even him. He reached out to every contact he could find, local charities, legal aid offices, volunteer groups, telling them the story he had been a part of from the beginning. Some knew about the video that had gone viral. Others listened in silence, then promised to look into what could be done. The next days were a blur of action. Michael took time off work, something he had never done before, and drove between meetings with social workers, interviews with journalists, and long conversations with attorneys who specialized in child advocacy. He spoke carefully but passionately, explaining how the children had chosen the dump because the shelter was worse for them, because they had been broken by the system meant to protect them. He played back the recordings on his phone, not the viral video everyone had seen, but the quieter moments, the glimpses of 3 siblings building a life out of scraps, surviving with dignity in a place no child should have to call home. At first there was resistance. The officials wanted to remind him of regulations, of procedures, of how dangerous it was for children to live unsupervised. But Michael did not argue with that. He simply asked if they thought the current solution had worked. He asked them if they had seen the bruises, the hollow looks, the way the youngest girl had stopped speaking. Silence usually followed. Gradually, support began to grow. A nonprofit offered to help place the children in a special foster program that emphasized stability. A lawyer volunteered to represent their case pro bono. Donations began to pour in from strangers online, people who had been touched by the story and wanted to see it end differently. Michael went back to the dump every evening during this time, not just to check on the children, but to let them know he had not abandoned them. He brought food and blankets, not out of charity, but as a promise that they were no longer invisible. The boy began to meet him halfway across the lot, still cautious but less guarded, as if some small piece of trust had been rebuilt. The older girl asked for news, and though Michael could not give details, he told her change was coming. The youngest started speaking again in short bursts, words so soft he had to lean close to hear them. Weeks passed, and then one morning, just as the frost was starting to settle over the ground, Michael stood with the children outside a new house. It was not large, just a small rental on the edge of town provided by the charity, but it had 4 solid walls, a working furnace, and real beds inside. The social workers had been convinced this was the safest interim solution until a permanent placement could be arranged. For now, the children would live under temporary guardianship, supervised but not imprisoned. Michael had signed papers agreeing to be one of their legal advocates, a responsibility that felt heavier than any job he had ever held. When they stepped inside, the children moved slowly, as though the floor might give way beneath them. The boy ran a hand over the table, testing its smooth surface. The older girl touched the curtains, opened and closed them, fascinated by the simple privacy they provided. The youngest curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow as if it were the rarest thing she had ever been given. Michael stayed late that night, helping set up the space, showing them where things were kept, making sure the heat was working. When he finally left, he stood outside for a long moment, looking back at the light spilling from the windows. It was only a beginning, he knew, but it was more than they had before. At home, the house felt different. His wife had been watching him quietly through all these weeks, seeing the changes in him, and now she joined him at the table. For the first time since the fight about the watch, they spoke without anger. She admitted she had not understood what the watch meant to him, how deep the wound had been when it was thrown away. He told her it wasn't only about the watch anymore. Something in him had shifted since that morning he first went to the dump. He could not undo the past, but he could choose what kind of man he would be going forward. A few days later, Michael attended an estate auction downtown. He had seen a listing for a vintage watch similar to the one his father had given him. When he held it in his hands after winning the bid, he expected to feel only relief, but what he felt was more complicated, a quiet acceptance. This was not his father's watch. That one was gone forever, somewhere under layers of trash and soil. But this one would be a symbol, a reminder that he had chosen not to let loss be the final word. On the following Sunday, he drove to the house where the children now lived. They were in the yard kicking a ball back and forth. The boy still carried himself like someone prepared for a fight, but his shoulders seemed looser, his face brighter. The older girl waved at him, and the youngest ran forward to meet him at the gate. Michael knelt and let her hug him before stepping inside. He sat with them on the porch steps until evening, listening to their stories, laughing when the youngest proudly showed him the picture she had drawn of their new home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he glanced at the watch on his wrist, its face catching the last light of day. Time, he thought, was no longer just a reminder of what he had lost. It was a measure of what he had found, and of what still lay ahead. When he finally drove away, he felt lighter than he had in months. The dump was still out there on the edge of the city, the shack still standing in slow decay, but the children were no longer a part of it. They had stepped into something new, and in a way, so had he. As the lights of the city came into view, Michael touched the watch once more. Its ticking was steady, unbroken, like a promise kept. Somewhere behind him, the fire in the little can had gone out for good. Ahead, the road stretched open under the night sky, leading toward a future he could no longer fear. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.